GGG have released a big patch for Path of Exile 2, update 0.3.1, and it's all about the endgame. This patch is very significant not just for the changes being made, but also for its indication of what's to come in the next big update, that being patch 0.4 in December. Now we know that 0.4 will have a heavy focus on the endgame. They've said as much in Q&As and in interviews, and Jonathan also mentioned this in the recent video on the topic of patch 0.3.1, saying that they'll be saving the endgame content for patch 0.4, but they wanted to take the opportunity to put some of the mechanical system changes into the game right now, so that they can begin testing these changes and begin gathering feedback. And this patch is a big deal, make no mistake about it, these are huge changes to the endgame. Tower juicing is gone, they still exist on the Atlas, but only for their exploration purposes. Then there's changes to precursor tablets, they now essentially work as multi-use scarabs, so you're able to juice up each individual map just how you like. And on top of those changes, there will also now be a map boss in every map, and every map will always generate at least one random piece of extra content. There are also a bunch of smaller changes to help streamline the endgame experience too, but overall these changes should help out a bunch in making the endgame gameplay loop much more pleasant to interact with. However, patch 0.3.1 is also very telling of what's to come in 0.4, because ever since Path of Exile 2's early access launch in December last year, many players have questioned the implementation of the infinite scrolling Atlas endgame. This one is very divisive, some players love it, some hate it, but one thing was for sure, and that is that this endgame system for PoE2 was very hastily put together right before launch. We know that they only spent about 3 months on it, and it seemed like there was always a possibility that this would just be a placeholder of sorts, and that when the time came, it may be replaced with something else. After all, this is not a completely unimaginable scenario, because GGG have reinvented the Path of Exile 1 endgame and its progression several times over the years. But with the changes in patch 0.3.1, and with Jonathan mentioning that they are front-loading system changes now to make way for content updates later, it would appear that the Infinite Atlas is here to stay. So with that in mind, I wanted to put forward some discussion on the upsides and the downsides of the Infinite Atlas, taking into account not just the current game, but the potential of these systems in a distant future version of Path of Exile 2. So let's begin with the downsides of the Infinite Atlas, and the first one is likely the biggest one. That's a lack of player agency in terms of the maps that you can run. This one is by far the biggest complaint when it comes to the Infinite Atlas system, and it's only made worse by the existence of a considerable amount of maps that many players would consider as bad layouts. Especially following the addition of Sprint, because Sprint really doesn't mesh well with some of those narrow, winding layouts. Now, one of the reasons that this is one of the most unpopular parts of the Infinite Atlas is because Path of Exile 1 already has an endgame where, if you want to, you can run the exact same map layout with the exact same mechanics and the same juicing over and over again endlessly. Meanwhile, if you want to, you can also choose to not do that, and instead run a variety of maps with a variety of different scarabs, and even utilize the multiple different Atlas trees to run all sorts of different content. However, the same is not true for Path of Exile 2, because the choice is not there. You cannot choose to continuously run the same map layout over and over. Instead, you're forced to run a variety of different maps. Now this would be okay if there were a handful of bad layouts, but there's a lot more than a handful, there's actually quite a lot of bad layouts. However, notably, one of the improvements they're making in patch 0.3.1 is to reduce the size of some of the bigger maps, so that might play a role in improving this issue, but we could certainly do with some more open plan layouts on the Atlas too to help balance out those bad layouts. Now this plays into the exploration of the Atlas, which I think can be very special, but the lack of choice here is quite damaging, and I think ideally there should be some systems that allow you to have a bit more agency over which maps you run. For example, they could revisit the favoured map system, where you can favourite one map per biome, and that map then has a more likely chance to spawn over the other maps in that biome. Alternatively, you could have a map banning system where you can ban one map per biome so that it never shows up. But ultimately, I just feel that more player agency in terms of map selection would be a big improvement here. Next up in the downsides for the Infinite Atlas is the progression element. Now, when I looked up all of the feedback that I could find on the Atlas endgame for PoE 2 on the forums and on the Reddit and in YouTube videos and comments and in live streams, I found this one topic that kept coming up time and time again, and that's the Atlas progression. A lot of players don't like it. A lot of them say they can't feel the progression, or that there's a lack of any real direction, and this definitely resonated with me. Because coming from Path of Exile 1, where each league you fill out your Atlas completion by doing every single map on the Atlas with all of the bonus objectives, and you really feel that progress because every single map provides an Atlas passive point, so you're building more and more agency over specializing into the content that you want to play as you complete the Atlas, and then you complete it. So you get that dopamine hit, and that's when the true endgame begins, and you can begin to farm whatever content you like. But it doesn't really feel like that in PoE 2, and I think part of the issue here is that the Atlas passive tree is just not that great right now. It's not very interesting and it's a bit too generic. I'd like to see a lot more nodes on there for a start, and a lot more specific nodes that change or specialize content. I'm also not convinced that the particular mechanic trees like Ritual or Expedition should be separate from the main tree with different conditions to obtain points, but that's another topic entirely. I think the current method of obtaining Atlas tree points by cleansing corruption is a bit bland, especially when you do it over and over, and I will go on to that topic again in the upside section a bit later in this video because I think there's some potential there. But first, let's discuss the last downside for the Infinite Atlas in this video. The whole scrolling and finding and keeping track of points of interest. This is a system that doesn't feel all that great to interact with, but a big problem here is that it gets worse the more you play. The more you progress outwards, the harder it is to keep track of where everything is because you begin to cover a larger and larger area. Now, GGG did add bookmarks to the Atlas, but that system just feels like a band-aid solution, a bit like checkpoints in maps, and I'm not really sure what the ideal solution is here. Perhaps the Atlas shouldn't actually be infinite, perhaps there should be a gameplay loop that resets the Atlas in some way, I'm not too sure. But one thing that will help to at least improve this issue a little bit is to allow us to zoom out a bit further on the Atlas map. I know that many players have been asking for that, and I think that would be a great improvement straight away. Now let's move on to the upsides, the benefits of an Infinite Atlas compared to other endgame systems. And we're beginning with what is, in my opinion, the single greatest upside to the Infinite Atlas, and that is exploration. The idea that the Atlas endlessly goes on and on in all directions is one that can seem a bit daunting at first, but one of the highlights of this concept is the unknown that hides in the fog. The idea that you never really know what you're going to find as you push further and further and reveal more and more of the Atlas. Now, the potential of exploration in PoE 2's endgame can be extremely high, but this hinges on GGG introducing a lot of exciting things that the player can find. Now, they have added quite a few fun things to find in the patches since the early access launch. We have quite a few interesting unique map encounters, for example, like the Nameless Seer. That's always a fun one to find because you just never know what he's going to offer you. Whilst unique maps such as Castaway or Untainted Paradise can feel great depending on which stage of character progression you're at when you find them. And of course there's Citadels that you can see in the fog. The spawn rate of those needs to be increased, I think, but I'm sure that's on their radar. And then in the current update they introduced Abyss, and you can rarely find maps that are overrun by Abyss, which is quite fun if your PC can handle it. And they also added the Anomaly bosses, which are fun to find because they can potentially drop a very valuable lineage support gem. However, I'm not sure how fun these will be or how they'll feel to interact with if the lineage support gems that drop from them are significantly nerfed, which is quite likely, I think. There is already quite a few fun things to find in the game right now, but I believe they're only just scratching the surface when it comes to the potential of exploration. There is so much more that can be done here. For example, I'd like to see a mechanic where an entire biome can be overrun by a particular mechanic, and in some cases it could change the mechanic. So let's say a biome is overrun by Ritual. Instead of Ritual altars in those maps, the whole map could just be full of ritual monsters, and then there's a giant ritual altar in the boss room, and you get to kill all of the monsters again, including the boss. Or it could be overrun by delirium, and there's no delirium mirror when you enter the map. Instead, you're just always delirious, and you become more and more delirious the more monsters you kill, and then both Chosis and Omniphobia could join the map boss in the boss room. I think these would be some fun encounters to find on the Atlas, and it would provide a lot of potential for juicing and farming specific content, and there's also a lot of really basic things that could be done. For example, sometimes you could just stumble into a map and it has 2 or 3 map bosses in the boss room instead of 1. Or perhaps there's a map that can be found that's similar to the Moment of Zen with, Nameless Seer, where you find an NPC like the Ferryman from the Interludes, but instead of selling you greater runes, he sells you a selection of much rarer runes that can normally only drop from Wisp content. And like with the Nameless Seer, you just don't know what you're going to get offered. Perhaps it's one or several of the very rare and valuable runes. But overall, I think exploration is a huge plus to the Infinite Atlas, as long as GGG can continue to add fun things to find to keep the Atlas interesting to explore. Now, the next upside for the Infinite Atlas is mapping and content variety. So I already discussed the downsides of a lack of player agency in regards to map choice, and the flip side to that point is experiencing a lot of variety as you play through the Atlas. Because the maps on the Atlas are already predetermined and you just place a blank waystone in there to run them, that means that you're running a constant stream of different maps. And you can be sure that you won't be running the same map over and over, and that also means that with the new changes in 0.3.1, you'll be seeing lots of different map bosses as well, because there's going to be a map boss in every map, and you'll also get at least one piece of random extra content in each map too, so there should be a lot of variety in all aspects. This plays back into the exploration theme of the Atlas, and in a way, these two parts go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. So I feel for exploration to actually be satisfying, you kind of need those bad layout maps to exist in some quantity at least, so that you can feel good about finding something special when it does appear. Now, moving on to another potential upside for the Infinite Atlas, and I say potential upside because I don't think this part is quite there yet, but the progression and completion of the Infinite Atlas could be really interesting. Right now, the Cleanse the Corruption system isn't great in my opinion, but there's an opportunity here to tie this part of the Atlas in with the exploration a bit more than just seeking out the same thing over and over. I like the idea that when you find something interesting on the Atlas, that thing can become an objective for you. So going back to the concept from the exploration section where a biome is overrun by ritual monsters, for example, let's say you stumble upon this biome, well, now your objective could be to clear this ritual biome. And perhaps at that point, one of the overrun ritual maps becomes the stronghold of that cluster of maps, and in that map, maybe you fight a version of the King in the Mist, or perhaps it's a Wildwood mini-boss or something like that. And I think this idea of the Atlas objectives changing and being influenced by your own exploration on the map could be a really fun avenue to go down for this endgame system. Now overall, I'm not fully sold on the Infinite Atlas endgame in PoE2 just yet. I do prefer Path of Exile 1's Atlas system quite a bit more, but I think the Infinite Atlas does have a lot of potential if they can make exploration really fun and iron out some of the other issues. But what are your thoughts on PoE2's endgame, and do you think I've been baited by this 0.3.1 patch and they are actually going to do a full overhaul on the whole thing? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.